All right. Thanks, Rocky. Appreciate it. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. We appreciate your attendance, and given the circumstances, unfortunately, we have to do this virtually. However, we are committed to getting as much information and answering all questions that we receive tonight, and continuing to engage interested parties, stakeholders, and affected landowners in relation to this project, and how it's tied in with the diversion project. You'll see on the screen, and if you can, I'm showing a map of the diversion project in overall aerial view that shows the channel component in the light blue color, as well as a number of different elements of the channel, the aqueducts, and some of the inlets. And on the lower part of the map, if you can see, it's in dark blue is the federal component of the project. In the yellow box is where we're identifying the Drain 27 Wetland Mitigation Project. And as you can see, it's right next to the southern embankment, just northeast of the inlet and control structure. The project will contain all the wetland mitigation necessary for the dark blue components of the comprehensive project. And we'll get into some of the regulatory details and the reasoning behind that in a few minutes. As Rocky mentioned, this is less than ideal, but we're transitioned to this virtual environment, so unfortunately we'll have to try to answer as many questions here. You can put them in the chat. We'll stop periodically throughout the presentation and allow for voice questions as well. There are informational sheets that were mailed out to affected landowners. And as Rocky had indicated as well, you can find those on the diversion website if you'd like to get more information after the meeting. And with that, I will turn it over to Derek with the U.S. Corps of Engineers to begin the content of the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So my name is Derek Ingmelson. I'm a biologist and project manager for this project, and I'll kind of walk you through an overview of what the Drain 27 Wetland Restoration Project is, why we're doing it, and that sort of thing. And as Rocky mentioned earlier, we'll have a couple places where we'll stop and allow questions, because it is something that you guys are hearing for the first time, and you probably have some different thoughts or questions on it. So to start off, the first question that you might be thinking is why is this project being considered? What's the need for this project? And there are a few different reasons. One is to mitigate the unavoidable wetland impacts. Joel said this area is going to provide wetlands to mitigate for impacts of that dark blue area that was on the map earlier. That's about 244 acres of wetland impact, and the wetlands that people typically think of are kind of the standing water, maybe cattails, that sort of thing. But a lot of the wetlands that are impacted from this project are ones that you wouldn't typically think of. They're areas and fields that might be less productive. They have standing water for part of the year, but that's the majority of the impacts that we're talking about. When we considered this area for the mitigation, one of the reasons why was because we noticed in the hydraulic modeling that it was very difficult to keep this area dry with the project in place. And the models were showing us that at about a 7 or 8 year flood event, that water from the Wild Rice River would back up the Barrow Ditch, which will be along the southern side of the southern embankment, or the Fargo Dam, and they will back up in this area, making it wet. And a group of us talked about it, and for people trying to farm that area, having it flood out once every 7 or 8 years is probably not acceptable. And so we started considering it for other uses. One use that would be very productive would be for the mitigation. It would cover those impacts that I talked about, and we also feel that it could be a very good site for restoring a wetland. And when I say restoring a wetland, you might look at this site and say, you know, this isn't a wetland. We farmed it forever, but there's three different factors that go into making a wetland, and that's on the next slide here, so I won't get into that too much. But you know, we look at some of the different indicators of a wetland, and this area seems to have that. And you can imagine over the settlement of this area that it's changed quite a bit. People have, you know, tried to make it so it's more conducive to agricultural uses, and Drain 27 has been added. So that helps get the water off the landscape. Next slide. So that comes to the question, what is a wetland? And I said there's three characteristics to that, and one is the soils, another is the hydrology, so how much water is on the land, and then the third thing is the vegetation. And these are all very closely connected. The hydric soils, that's just a scientific term for a type of soil that has characteristics of having water on that landscape. And, you know, it's likely that before this area was modified, that there was water for longer than there currently is. There's a picture of a hydric soil there. It doesn't look like much, but there's certain features within there that make it that classification. The hydrology, how much water is on this land. There's a graph of a hydrograph on there right now, and it shows kind of the inputs and the outputs of water that we believe will be in this area. So we've taken a look at what we believe it would look like if we go through this restoration process, and it looks like we would have enough water to get the conditions needed for a wetland. And then finally, if you have those two characteristics, you likely have something that will support aquatic vegetation. And again, you know, cattails is kind of what people think of, but this picture right here shows that there's a diversity of different vegetation types that are considered wetland vegetation, and that would be idealistic to get a good diverse area with different vegetation in it in a wetland complex. Next slide. So why are wetlands important? There are a number of different reasons that wetlands are important. They provide infiltration, so water purification. They also take out nutrients that are bad for the environment and prevent them from getting to other sources like our streams and rivers. They also support wildlife. If we go to the next slide. There's a number of different types of wildlife that are found in wetlands. You've got common species, a lot of your migratory birds like trumpeter swans shown here. There's also a lot of dabbling ducks that use it, like your mallards, pintails, wood ducks that use it as nesting location. And then you've got some other species that you don't typically think of so much, but like the tiger salamander here, it uses this type of habitat quite frequently, especially one like this that would be void of any fish. That would be really good habitat for salamanders and other amphibians. Next slide. So what is a restoration? Restoration is trying to get those three factors, those three characteristics back to the landscape. So right now we've got the soils. That's something that won't change. Those hydric soils are kind of always there. The vegetation, we don't have that. This area is currently farmed, so the vegetation is planted and taken out on a yearly basis. And then we also need to get some hydrology in there. So the way that we would restore this area is we need to get that hydrology back by creating a weir or some way of capturing the water in this area instead of losing it down the drain like currently is. But if we build that weir, that will inundate an area and capture that water. We've got nice clay soils here, so we're not going to have much infiltration, and that water will be lost only through a few different means of like evaporation and evapotranspiration through the plants. And some of those different functions that I mentioned before, your water purification and your nutrient cycling, those different functions will be restored, and that's really what we're looking for, is a functional wetland that will help get us some of those benefits back. Next slide. So where is this project located? In the intro, Joel kind of mentioned where it's at. This further identifies that. You see the yellow square there. It's going to be in the western third of what we call the camel hump, that area that sort of bumps up there. Next slide. This next slide defines it a little bit further. There is south of County Road 14. So you see County Road 14 on the northern side of the picture shown. For those of you on the phone, I'll try to describe this so you get a good picture of it in your mind. But it's south of County Road 14, and it's north of County Road 16. And then it's bounded on the west by 57th Street. It'd be east of 57th Street. Two different roads. If you're really familiar with the area and you know the intersection of 57th Street South and 112th Avenue South, that's kind of the heart of where this wetland will be. And there are stretches along both of those roads that would be removed as part of this wetland restoration, so that wetland could span across those two areas. Next slide. So what does this area look like? In total, the area is expected to be about 320 acres. 150 acres of that would be areas that we could call wetlands themselves. So those of you that can see the picture on the screen, or those of you at home that maybe have the handout in front of you, what we're looking at is the figure with the aerial photography, so you can see the fields, and it has the wetland complex shown in blue and green, and then some of the parcels that will be impacted in kind of a reddish pink color. The wetland within this area is in the blue and the green color. The blue area would be kind of the ponded area of the wetland, where, after a rain event, we could expect water being held to that elevation until it evaporates or is lost through transpiration processes. The green area just adjacent to that, this is area that would be, it would have that hydrology underneath the surface of the soil. So it would still technically be a type of wetland, but not the type of wetland with standing water. So like a wet meadow or seasonally inundated type of wetland. So that makes up the 150 acres. Something else that's also required of our wetland sites is a 50-foot buffer around the wetland area. That's a little bit more difficult to see. There is a yellow area around that green, and that would make up another 70 acres, that buffer. And then finally, there was some areas that were kind of irregular because the wetland isn't, a squared off feature. It kind of has fingers. And so some of those are very difficult to access after this is in place, or they're very inefficient for farming. Farm machinery can be difficult to get into certain places. And so a team of us kind of sat down and looked at that and made determinations where we felt it would be best that it was included in the complex. Another thing with that is that this land, we'd like to have very definable boundaries. And if you have straight lines, that makes that easier than something that's jagged and goes all over the place. So those are the reasons that it looks the way it does at this point. Now, this is all preliminary, and we're in the early stages of this process. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to have this meeting, is to get input, and we value your guys' input and can hopefully apply some of that to our design. Something else to make aware on the map here is the orange and yellow lines kind of to the northeast of the wetland complex. those are two different areas that are being considered for an access road or a maintenance road to the weir. So the weir would be on the west side of where that yellow and orange line are. And we have to make sure that we can get to that site for any repairs or anything that's needed. So these are two different options that we're currently looking at. And we'll be talking with some of those landowners to get their input and in the design of that. Next slide. So with that, this is our first stop for allowing questions. I know there's a lot that we've went over here. So Rocky's gonna unmute the speakers right now so that people can ask questions.
I'm gonna unmute everybody if you can try to do this in an orderly fashion if there's multiple people talking. So I'm gonna unmute right now. Everybody is unmuted, so please try to keep the volume down. Looks like there is a chat question if you want to address that first. How does this benefit the landowner?
So this whole area, regardless of if the wetland project is done or not, will be either bought out or will have flood easements on it. And as I talked about before with the modeling, we've been seeing that these areas are going to be inundated like 1 out of every 7 or 8 years. So you're going to have probably significant water on the land where this wetland is in place. So it's probably going to have marginal value as farmland where this wetland is. So hopefully that addresses that question.
Somebody have a question?
Yes, I do. I got a question about why you're putting a wetland which is going to flood every 7 or 8 years. And isn't the idea of a wetland to preserve and protect all the so-called nesting spots and all that? What's going to happen when you put 7 or 8 feet of water on top of this, like you're telling us is going to happen behind the dam? What's the sense of having a wetland right up against a dam?
Yeah, so some of those wetland benefits that I covered earlier with the water quality and things, those are benefits of a wetland. You're keeping that water from flushing directly into the borrow ditch that would then go into the Wild Rice River or the diversion. So it's allowing that water to get filtered out somewhat before it reaches there. Another thing too is all the wildlife that'll be able to use this area. And you mentioned that when the project's in operation, that this area will be flooded. And we looked at the durations of that flooding, and under extreme events, it looks like the number of days where it would be flooded would meet some of the criteria that we found for wetland areas. So I think like 14 days or something like that was the number, and that was sufficient for wetland vegetation to survive that long, or at least portions of it. So even though it's underwater for a certain amount of time, if the project goes into operation, we feel that this area would be able to rebound and become or be sustainable as a wetland.
So you're telling me if you, in July, if you have, or in the spring, if you have wildlife nesting and they have a nest of eggs, that those eggs can sit underwater for 14 days and you're not going to hurt any of that wildlife you're trying to protect?
No, that would not be the case. I mean, with flooding, even in the natural world, you're going to have nests that get flooded out and things like that. So in this area, it would be no different. They unfortunately would not be able to be underwater that long.
So this is not a natural world, though. You're creating this wetland.
we're restoring this wetland. So there are signatures in this area that it was once a wetland type. Now, it might not be a wetland with standing water, but it was likely like the wet meadow type or a seasonally inundated area.
Well, I have my deed here from 1880 something, and it was purchased from the railroad, so it wasn't a wetlands in the 1800s. So that's a long time ago that you're saying it was a wetland.
Yeah,
Has this been approved by the Ecological Department of North Dakota? Have they approved this plan?
So North Dakota Game and Fish, the Soil and the State Water Commission, Department of Health, they've all been part of our group that has looked at this wetland, and we've had meetings on this to help look at different designs and how we want it to operate. So a lot of the state agencies have been hand in hand with us in this development, support the project.
So has the biologist, Drew Becker, approved it?
Drew Becker has not been on the team for this, no.
Have they approved it?
I'm sorry, who is they?
The Ecological Department, North Dakota Ecological Department, have they approved it? I know you've been working with them, but have they approved it?
Nobody, I guess, has approved this yet, but we have gotten support from all the agencies that are part of our natural resource agency meeting.
Okay, thank you.
But you're going to need an approval for this from the state of North Dakota, aren't you?
Yeah, we'll need different permits to be able to do this, yes.
So are you going to start this before you get your permits like you did the other structures that are being constructed now?
That's a little outside my wheelhouse, so I'll refrain from that question, I guess.
I got another question on your drainage for this area. There's a lot of acres that drain through Drain 27 from the southwest that go into this area. You're talking about creating a wetland. How are we going to drain that land when it's going to dump into a wetland with a dam on it? And how are we supposed to expect the rest of our land that we farm to be drained adequately? This sounds like a complete disaster for the whole area out here if you want to continue to have the farmers farm this.
Yeah, so we do have a drainage plan. There is a ditch that will be along the south side of the southern embankment. And we've got hydraulic engineers looking at that. And again, that's not quite my forte, so I don't know how to answer that question. If you have questions on the wetlands, that's kind of what I'm more here to answer.
Do you have a height that will not go over?
Yeah, so the weir structure that will be at the north end of the wetland, we're currently looking at a design elevation of 906.3. So
how many feet of water will it hold at that point?
So I think the ditch at that point is somewhere around like 901, 902. So the structure would be, 5 feet high.
From
and
the
that's within the ditch. That's the bottom of the ditch, yes.
So where is the water drain once it goes over the weir?
It would go into that borrow ditch or drainage ditch that's on the south side of the embankment. So a lot of that water would go toward the Wild Rice River, and then there is a small portion that would go toward the diversion.
Aren't you, with that type of plan that you're talking about, you're kind of sending water backwards, aren't you?
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, the normal flow of that water is to the northeast. That's how Drain 27 flows. So now you're going to tell me you're going to send it back to the east back south, and then back east over to the Wild Rice River?
Yep. So our engineering team has come to the conclusion that that's the best way to drain this area.
Okay.
Derek, this is Keith Weston. It was my understanding, you're correct, the water would go two different directions depending. Some of it, it'll both go along the south side of the embankment, but some will go back to the inlet or outlet structure, and then some of it would go in a ditch back to the Wild Rice River.
Yep. The majority of it would go toward the Wild Rice. There's a portion of it that would go toward the inlet structure.
So what's
So
going
there'll
to be,
be, I'm sorry, go ahead.
can I ask the question, what's going to happen to the remainder of the land that each landowner owns along this wetland?
That'd be
What are we gonna do with that?
land acquisition question. So I don't know if Dean, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, this is Dean. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so any of the land that's not part of the Drain 27 wetland mitigation preliminary footprint that you're seeing right now on the screen, those other remainders of the parcels would be, the property right that we would need would be a flowage easement. Acres.
But yeah, we're going to be subject to a lot of drainage issues.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you there, Terry.
I said, but you expect a flowage easement on this, but we're going to be subject to a bunch of other drainage issues when this is in place. Because if that dam is at 906, you're adding maybe 2-3 feet of water in this area. That's a lot of water to be held back that you're going to hold water back all the way to County Road 16. If you're putting another 2-3 feet of water in this pool there, that's not going to drain. I don't understand how all the drainage is going to drain through there if you're putting a dam. You need it to drain completely down in the channel to drain the farmland. I don't see how it's all going to work. You got a lot of explaining to do if you expect us to just give up our farmland and take a flowage easement on this.
Yeah,
Well-
so I can probably answer a little bit of that too. So the blue area on the map, that area is where when the weir is up to the top with water, that blue area is where you could expect water to be standing. And then the area in green, that's a foot higher in elevation. That area is up to a foot higher in elevation. So we don't anticipate seeing any impacts to lands past that as far as having the drainage affected. The weir is also being designed so that, so a flood's one thing. If this area floods, there's just so much we can do to get the water off, right? Like if it's completely inundated. But if it's flooding due to like a local rainfall event, like a 10-year local rainfall event, we're looking at that with the weir design to try to make it so that that water will leave the complex within 24 hours, like get to that 906.3 elevation. So we're going through the design of that weir right now to try to address what you're talking about to some extent.
So I guess just to clarify, the boundaries, the blue and the tannish or greenish band that Derek was referring to are all included within the red outline or the red areas, which everything within the red areas as shown on this exhibit will be bought in fee title. Or at least preliminarily with this layout. And then anything outside of the red is all within the upstream mitigation area, and those areas would be compensated for by a flowage easement.
So Dean, everything in the green, you're considering flowage easements on?
Well, I guess you got the blue area is where the water, we project the water is going to reside at a 906.3 weir height. And then I guess, I don't know, it looks like more of a tan in my screen, but the tan border that's just outside of the blue is that, safety margin. And then outside of that, there's some red areas, which are the areas that either were remnants that were inaccessible, or because of modern farming practices and equipment sizes, we decided, hey, it might be good to just square this off and buy it versus, having to bump in, bump out, all those kinds of things. I guess that's what I was trying to get at.
So there's more opportunities to ask questions when we move along here. So I think maybe at this point we can present the last few slides and then ask more questions at the end. So another thing that's worth mentioning is the schedule for the project. Currently, we're doing this public meeting, trying to reach out and make everyone aware of what we're working on. And we really want to take your guys' input and try to use that to help us design this. All right, I got muted there for a second. Back. So the project design, we're looking at hydrology assessments. We've already gotten that done. So we've looked at the area after the project's in place and determined that we're going to have a large enough watershed to be able to supply water to this wetland. We're currently doing some hydraulic modeling just to see how the water moves when the project is in operation, the larger project's in operation. And then from that, we'll be able to determine the weir design. Like, is this a concrete weir? Is it a rock weir, sheet pile, that sort of thing. And then there's other design considerations that we're doing with our partnering agencies as far as like, what does the actual area within the wetland look like? Do we want to create some topographic diversity, like some deeper holes, some shallower holes? Where are those located within the complex? And then, of course, we need to seed the areas. There's not really a seed bank for this area because it is mostly farmed. So we need to bring that seed in, and we'll seed the areas. Some plants like to have wetter feet than others, so different seed mixes will need to be used. And so that process that's going on right now is going to overlap with some of these other things. We've got property acquisition, which can start once we get our design to a certain point. And it looks like that point where we'll be able to start that acquisition phase is this summer. And it would be this summer through next summer. So the land agents that Dean works with, they'll start to reach out to you folks once we have a better grasp of our design and get to that certain point. Another thing that we need to do is we need to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and we would put together an environmental assessment document to look at the impacts of what this project might have. Part of that process is a public comment period. So when that document is ready for public review, it'll be sent out, and there'll be a 30-day comment period that anybody can submit. We'll consider those comments and then finalize the document. It looks like that will be late this year. I think late November to early January is kind of what we're projecting. And then we have the construction contract award, which comes after the NEPA process, and that would be probably sometime like the fall of 2021. And then once that contract has been awarded, it would be the next construction season when the complex was constructed. So we're looking at a 2022 construction season Right now, we're thinking that would just be 1 year of construction. The vegetation establishment, that will take a little bit longer. Usually you've got at least 5 years before some of that vegetation really comes in. If we start having problems with invasive species, invasive vegetation, that could take longer. But right now, this is the schedule that we've got laid out and that we're looking to meet. Next slide. So that was a lot of information on the schedule. I'm sure there's again, we'll do like we did before and allow questions at this time.
Hey, Derek, this is Dean. I see we've got a question on the chat board here. It says, if built, will Drain 27 continue flowing water from the wetland under the southern, I think he means the southern embankment and across County Road 18 or 14 as it does now?
No,
and I guess I can take a crack at that if you want.
Yeah, you can go for it, Dean.
Maybe if we could go back to page 12 on the, just so we can look at the map of the slides. So just so everyone's aware, the Weir location is actually going to be where the two options for the maintenance route come together there. So like where the orange line and the yellow line meet there. So it's going to be a little bit slightly west of that, right where the current Drain 27 legal drain resides. Okay. And after completion of actually both the Drain 27 Wetland Restoration Project and also the SE2 reach of the southern embankment, from what I understand, the starting point of Drain 27 will then move to the north end of the southern embankment. So a little bit north, if the hand can move up a little ways to the north end of the footprint of the embankment, right about in that area is where Drain 27 will legally begin. And I think Kurt is on as well. So I don't know if Kurt has any he's the water engineer for the Southeast Cass Water Resource District.
Yeah, I can jump on here. Thanks, Dean. So if this project happened the way it's drawn up, the legal drain, there's a proceedings it would have to go through, but essentially it would go through a reassessment. The area south of the southern embankment would have to be removed from the assessment district. There would be a drain abandonment and a transition of the right-of-way would go to the fee title right-of-way that becomes the wetland. So the drain would start north of the southern embankment. The assessment boundary would get cut off, but that's all to be determined. This will have to come be presented to the Southeast Cass Water Resource District and some agreements put into place, but that's the way it looks like that would have to be done.
And then Kurt, just a little follow-up. So then north of that, then it would go under County Road 14 just as it does now, and it probably would be holding less water, I would think, after the southern embankment is built. So,
well, it's a ditch today, so it'll just have a smaller drainage area.
Yeah.
The drain to the north will function even better than it does today because the drainage area will be smaller.
Okay, thank you.
This is Jake Gust. Who's going to be responsible for operation and maintenance of this plan? And it looks like there's a lot of land that won't support aquatic vegetation. What's going to be planted there? Is that going to be prairie grass? Or...
Yeah, so the areas that aren't considered wetland or aquatic, those are upland areas, and we do have native seed mixes that we've identified for those areas, so they would be, some of your upland grasses. And there was a question you had before that too. I'm blanking on that. What's that?
Who is responsible?
Yeah, so operation and maintenance would be the diversion authority would be responsible for that up until the point where we determine that the vegetation and the wetland functions meet the requirements of the Army Corps. And then at that point, they would still be responsible for it, but there has been some talk about some other agency possibly taking over the complex. North Dakota Game and Fish has shown some interest, so has NDSU. So maybe there's opportunities for one of those agencies to take over the long-term control of the site.
So you're going to acquire the land before you have the public meeting on it. Is that right?
The acquisition process would start prior to the public meeting, the next public meeting, yes.
Doesn't that seem backwards?
Well, the timeline that we've got right now, that's how it works out. We have to start that construction in 2022 for the impacts to be mitigated in a timely manner.
Seems backwards to me.
So it seems to me you're creating a wetland. I understand you need to replace wetlands, but it's pretty convenient that your wetland is going to protect those people that live along this drain in South Fargo that have all those nice homes at our expense. Can't you find wetlands somewhere else and leave us alone this time?
So with the diversion project in place, Drain 27 gets cut off anyway, so this wetland project doesn't provide any further protection for anybody to the north, I guess. Just looking at that hydraulic modeling that I mentioned earlier, it appears that this area is going to be wet more often than desirable for farming. So this is a way to have usefulness for that land that most likely will not be able to be farmed.
Most likely. But it's pretty good crops out there right now and has been for quite a few years.
Yeah, we're just using the information available to see what we think it would be like once the project is in operation.
I've got a couple of questions. Am I on?
Yep.
At what point will it start draining towards the inlet structure?
I guess I'm not familiar with the particulars of the drainage plan. There might be somebody on that can talk more to that.
I can handle that one if you want, Derek. I know Lyndon is on as well, so Lyndon, correct me if I misspoke. Can we go back to that map again on page 12 of the slides? Yep. Okay, so everything south of 112th Avenue south as it goes to the west and bumps into the, I guess in this case, it'd be the eastern edge of the southern embankment right in there. Anything south of that will flow into the inlet. And anything north of that will flow first north until it bumps into that corner and then run in front of the weir and then continue around the southern embankment on the inside or on the upstream mitigation side until it drops into the ditching that collects water in front of the wild rice control structure.
Is it going to be connected all the way? So if the water gets high enough, it would be allowed to flow back, continue to flow into the inlet structure?
You mean, will the inlet structure take on that water? Should there be some flows in that direction?
Well, if for some reason the Wild Rice River is sky high and it's not flowing to the Wild Rice River, is it open so it can flow over to the inlet structure?
it's getting a little deeper than I can cover. Lyndon, are you able to potentially address that question now, or is that something we need to come back with answers on?
I can try to address it a little bit. So the question really was, when will the water start to go west and south towards the diversion inlet structure? And essentially, there is when you get about a depth of a foot of water, once it gets inside the borrow ditch, just north of that drain 27 weir, so it'd take about a depth of water within the borrow ditch itself. Now, the borrow ditch is a substantially bigger channel than what the current drain is set at. And with that, the bottom of the borrow ditch is about 5.5 feet lower than the bottom or the crest of that weir structure. So it would take quite a bit of water from the wetland complex area to go from the wetland complex and then go to the west. But it does have the opportunity to go either way, depending on the water level within the borrow ditch and even within the wild rice. That would be when there is no FM diversion gate structure operation.
And then if you get the game and fish in there, what are they going to be hassling us to maintain the drainage on stuff that we are able to farm after all this?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, we're so early in those discussions with them that none of that's really been hashed out. But it would be focused on this restoration area, nothing outside of that.
Derek, there is a question in the chat that says, so is this project actually part of the diversion?
So this isn't in the diversion itself, the diversion channel. You can see on the figure that's on the screen along County Road 16 there to the south. If you go all the way to the west, that's pretty close to where the diversion inlet will be. Now we're looking at a different picture here, but the diversion inlet will be on the southwest. It'll be southwest of this area, so it's not actually part of the diversion itself.
This is Keith Weston, but it is part of the diversion project, not the structure itself, but it is mitigating for part of it. So mitigation is a component of the total project.
Right. Yep, that is correct. Yep. So it's worth mentioning too that a lot of the wetland impacts of the diversion channel itself will be mitigated within the diversion channel. So this portion of the mitigation is just for the southern embankment or the Fargo Dam portion of the project.
Are there any other questions at this time, or can Derek continue?
We've only got, the next slide is about property acquisition. So that'll go over to Dean, and then there's just one slide after that where we can answer a few more questions.
Okay, this is Dean Better, work on the land acquisition team here for the diversion. And many of you have maybe seen this model or this process before. This is also available on the website, but this is basically what we have gone through on all of our acquisitions for the project. I guess I will maybe point out one thing here is that the third bullet is right of entries requested to survey property, and many of you guys have, the property owners in this area have already gotten rights of entry requests and signed off on those, and many of those rights of entry have been to support the southern embankment design work. So that was including like cultural and other surveys that need to be done to maintain the or to ensure that we aren't infringing on any other property things that are associated with building that project. But we may have to get some additional rights of entry to not only pick up some of the corners for corners, but we also may have to validate some of the elevations that we've been using in the models. So we may need to just validate the elevations of certain areas of certain parcels that are part of the Drain 27 project. So it's a little deeper dive than maybe what was done on the first right of entry that was done with respect to the southern embankment. So I think we can go to the next slide. And this is like I mentioned, on the website is the information sheet that's available, which goes into a little bit more detail about the different steps that we progressed through during that acquisition process. And again, it's available on the FM Diversion Gov website under the library pull-down menu. So we can jump to the next slide. And then here's just a number of different contacts. Joel Paulson, who started the presentation, and then Derek Ingleson, who's the project lead on this and did the majority of the presentation. And then, of course, if there are any questions leading forward from, impacted property owners or water resource districts that are in the area, we can be contacted through the Cass County Joint Water Resource District, and those folks will get the right person connected with you for the question that you have. That's all I have.
There is a question in the chat that asks, how high is the southern embankment?
This is Dean again. Lyndon, are you able to jump in on that?
I don't recall off the top of my head. I can quick look it up here and get back to an answer if there are other questions.
Okay. We'll get back to that question. Are there any other questions that anyone wishes to bring forward or throw in the chat box?
This is Jake Gus again. It looks like we should have the plan should show how the water is going to get from the red all the way to the diversion and from the wild rice to the diversion. That channel should be shown, and the drainage ditches should be shown on here, because that's where most of the questions are coming from the landowners. They just don't see how that area is going to be drained.
Yeah, Jacob, one thing that, we're kind of working through the design of all this stuff right now, and we wanted to get this out to you guys as soon as possible to get input on things. So, a lot of the different designs that we're talking about are currently in progress, and so I think that's why there maybe isn't as much detail on some of the maps as we would like, but we really feel it's important to get this out there and make people aware of this. So that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, I guess I'll maybe just, this is Dean again. I will springboard off of what Derek said, and this is probably one of the earliest public meetings we've had on one of the sub-projects within the diversion project as a whole. And, we're, more than 2 years ahead of when the projected construction would begin. And so we just wanted to, I guess, make sure that the property owners were one of the first individuals to be publicly notified and, included in the formal presentation. And I guess that was the goal here. So, there may be a few questions out there that haven't been answered, but then again, the earlier we get the folks' input on things, the earlier we can potentially address things that haven't been considered or need to be considered or would be pertinent to the project as we see it in front of us here. So,
Hey, Dean.
yes.
Dean, can you hear me?
Yep, a little bit.
Well, I don't know if this question is for you, but is this area going to become a public place where people can come and walk through and, the kind of recreational thing that was in the diversion project to begin with? Are there going to be people out here, bumming around all the time out this area? Is that what it's going to be for the public to use also?
I don't know, Derek,
this is Matt from Cass County. Involved in a bunch of the rec meeting plans. And for initial discussion for this wetland mitigation site, there's discussion about it being a possibility, but as of right now, no.
Okay. Who's paying for this part of it? Is this part of the diversion itself?
Probably what they're going to do is start up a base park so they can.
You mean part of the diversion project or part of, this is a federal portion of the project. So normally the mitigation sites are open for public use. We haven't really got into those discussions too much though. So I think that is maybe yet to be determined. Long term, if it is managed by Game and Fish or NDSU, I would imagine that it might be, but there's a lot of different talks, I think, that need to go on between now and then.
All right.
I just, I see in the chat box, for those that may not see it, I know Lyndon was doing some work on the site as well, but Terry Williams has just piped in here on the chat box, said that the southern embankment elevation is at 928.5 in this general area. And so if the weir elevation is at 906.3, we're looking at about, a 22-foot difference between the top of the weir and the top of the southern embankment in this area.
Do you have any other questions? If there's people that would like to send, questions to the email that was on the screen earlier, you can email us or feel free to reach out. I believe my phone number was on the read ahead that was sent out too. All right, with that, I guess it's pretty quiet, so we could probably wrap the meeting up now, but like I said, feel free to reach out to any of us on the screen here, and we'll be happy to answer your questions or point you in the right direction. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for the help.
Everyone have a good night. We will be posting this video on fmdiversion.com. We'll also be sending out a letter to let you know where the YouTube link is for the recording of the meeting. Thanks, everybody, for your patience tonight.